His name echoes through millennia. Leonidas, king of Sparta. The leader who, with 300 of his bravest warriors, stood against the mighty Persian Empire at the immortal Battle of Thermopylae. A legend of courage and sacrifice. But how is such a hero forged? What harsh crucible shaped him? And what kind of world produced men who could face death with a smile? Let's travel back in time. Back to the day of his birth in the strange and harsh city of Sparta, around 540 BC. On that day, it wasn't just his fate hanging by a thread, but also that of 2 other children who saw the light around the same time, in the same unforgiving world. His relative or cousin, Alice, and another kinsman, Matthias, for whom a vastly different, tragically short story awaited. In Sparta, a newborn's cry wasn't always met with tears of joy or the immediate warmth of a mother's embrace. No, it was the start of the harshest test. The infant, be it Leonidas or Matthias, still bearing the marks of birth, was carried not to his mother, but to the meeting place of the elders, the Gerousia, men with faces as stern as rock, placed on a cold stone under their unforgiving, scrutinizing gaze. They weren't looking for childlike innocence, but for any sign of weakness, any crooked bone, any imperfection in form that might suggest a future unfit for a Spartan citizen. Poor Matthias, perhaps, as we recounted before, was born with a malformed right hand. Or maybe he just seemed frail or weak in a way that displeased the elders. Tragically for him, there was no room for pity or a second chance. The silent judgment, as sharp as a sword's edge, was passed. Unfit, Matthias was never returned to his mother. He was carried away to the Apothetai, a deep chasm at the foot of the imposing Mount Taygetus, to be left there alone, prey to the cold, starvation, or wild beasts. This was Sparta's first and most brutal law, declared in a deafening silence. The weak had no place in the Spartan shield wall. But Leonidas and also Alice passed the test. Perhaps their cries were strong, their forms deemed sound by the elders' critical eyes. The opposite verdict was given: fit. They were finally returned to their mother's arms. Not for excessive coddling, but for the Spartan mother's task to begin. Nursing strength into them along with milk, teaching them to suppress pain, and shielding them from any touch of luxury that might corrupt their innate toughness. They began breathing Sparta's demanding air from their very first moments. Leonidas spent his first 7 years in what might seem like childhood, but was, in reality, an intensive, indirect preparation phase. He learned the principles of strict obedience to his parents and elders. He watched the harsh training of his older brothers and engaged in rough games with his peers that served as early practice in combat and endurance. There were no fairy tales of princesses and dragons, but epic stories of Spartan heroes and their legendary sacrifices for their city. His mother instilled in him, day by day, the idea that his life was not his own, but belonged to Sparta. When the hour struck in his 7th spring, the transition was decisive and unemotional. No tears, no prolonged embraces. Perhaps his mother looked into his eyes with a firm resolve, handed him the short, coarse woolen tunic, virtually his only garment for years to come, and pushed him toward his destiny without a tender word of farewell. It was time for the Agoge, the legendary military upbringing system that would begin shaping his mind and body over the next 13 years, transforming him from a child into a warrior or break him in the process. Leonidas stepped through the barracks gate for the first time, a simple, harsh structure utterly unlike any home he'd known. He found himself in an Ela, or unit, with dozens of other boys, some disturbingly confident, others struggling to hide their fear. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and dust, and with an iron discipline overseen by older youths whose eyes held a hardness beyond their years. Here, he was no longer the king's son or anyone's son, just a new pace boy, raw material for Sparta's war machine. Life in the Agoge was an organized hell, designed to instill absolute obedience and superhuman endurance. The food, it was deliberately bad and scarce. The staple was the infamous black broth, melasomos, a repulsive mixture of boiled pig's blood, vinegar and salt, barely enough to sustain them. Its smell alone was said to repel non-Spartans. Hunger was a constant companion, but it wasn't just deprivation, it was a motivator, a drive for the boys to learn how to fend for themselves, even if it meant stealing. Sleep offered little real comfort. The boys slept together in the barracks on beds they made themselves from reeds gathered from the Helots river, broken by hand without knives. In winter, they might add some thistledown, believing it offered warmth, but they slept only in their short tunics, their bodies learning to endure the biting cold. Shoes were forbidden. They walked, ran, and trained barefoot year-round on Sparta's rocky terrain, until the soles of their feet hardened, becoming indifferent to pain or rough ground. Physical training was the beating heart of the Agoge. It wasn't just exercise, it was a constant test of will and body. Brutal wrestling aimed not just to pin an opponent, but to force submission or a show of pain, which was considered shameful. Bare-knuckle boxing that left bruises and scars. Grueling races across mountains and forests. Throwing the heavy javelin and discus with precision and power, and mastering the round shield, hoplon, and short sword, scyphos, that would be their companions until death. All under the watchful eyes of harsh instructors who tolerated no slacking. But the psychological cruelty was perhaps even more severe. Bullying wasn't just incidental behavior, it was a systematic pedagogical tool. The older boys, who had survived these stages themselves, supervised the younger ones, and this often meant constant harassment, demeaning nicknames, beatings for the slightest infraction, and forcing them to perform humiliating tasks. Complaining or crying only brought more humiliation. The goal? To break the individual spirit, teach blind obedience, instill the ability to endure insults without flinching, and foster absolute loyalty to the group and its leaders. They weren't raising individuals, they were forging soldiers who didn't feel, didn't question, only obeyed. And theft? It was taught as a virtue, if done cleverly. The constant hunger drove the boys to sneak out at night to steal food, whether from Helot farms or from supplies deliberately planted for this purpose. The crime wasn't the act of stealing itself, but failure. Anyone caught was flogged severely, not because he stole, but because he was clumsy or stupid enough to get caught. It was a dual message. Be bold and resourceful enough to meet your needs, but be cunning and stealthy enough to remain unseen. These skills of stealth and cunning would be vital for a soldier on the battlefield or on reconnaissance missions. In this rough, masculine world, isolated from the influence of women and family, strong and complex bonds formed between the boys. Friendship and loyalty to comrades in the unit were paramount. And here arose, or was solidified, that unique relationship between the Erasts, the older mentor lover, and the Eromenos, the younger beloved student. The older youth would take the younger under his wing, teaching, protecting, and serving as a role model. This bond often included a sexual dimension. which was accepted in the Spartan context, even seen as a way to strengthen combat bonds and loyalty. It was believed to teach martial virtues and ensure each partner would fight bravely to protect the other. It was another way of channeling emotions toward the military unit and the state. While Leonidas carved his path through the Agoge's harshness, his relative Alice was undergoing her own unique Spartan experience. One might expect the women's world to be the antithesis of the men's, a realm of softness and seclusion. But this was Sparta, where everything served the state and war. Yes, Alice and the girls of her generation were raised to be wives and mothers, but not just any mothers, mothers of warriors. Unlike the secluded women of Athens, Spartan women enjoyed remarkable freedom. Alice could move about freely, manage property. Women eventually owned a significant portion of Sparta's land and voiced her opinions boldly, even to men. But this freedom wasn't for personal indulgence. It was part of her role in a strong society. Most importantly, she underwent rigorous education and physical training. Girls participated in foot races, learned wrestling, and practiced throwing the discus and javelin. The goal wasn't to prepare them for battle, but to strengthen their bodies to endure multiple pregnancies and childbirths and to produce healthy, robust children. The belief was firm. Strong mothers bore strong sons, while cowardly or weak mothers might bear children unworthy of Sparta. Their participation in certain festivals and dances, scantily clad or even nude, was a display of this prized health and strength, a source of pride for the city. The Spartan mother was the primary guardian of society's values. She raised her sons, knowing they belonged first and foremost to the state. A mother famously bid farewell to her son going to war, saying, "Return with your shield or on it." There was no room for defeat or cowardice. Stories of mothers rejoicing at the news of their sons' deaths for Sparta, or disowning sons who fled battle, are integral to the harsh legend. The mother's toughness was the other side of the son's strength. When Leonidas turned 20, he officially graduated from the Agoge, but his real military life was just beginning. He became a full-fledged soldier and a member of a Krypteia, the communal dining mess that served as the primary social and military club of his life. Here, he ate, lived, and trained with his comrades, the bonds of military brotherhood replacing those of blood and family. At this stage, around age 20 or shortly after, he was expected to marry. But Spartan marriage was a strange, secretive affair. No lavish wedding feasts. The traditional method was a ritual abduction of the bride. The young man would sneak out at night, capture his bride, often prearranged, and take her away secretly. After spending the first night, he would return to the barracks at dawn as if nothing happened. These intermittent, clandestine visits under cover of darkness continued, their primary purpose being procreation. A husband wasn't allowed to live permanently with his wife until he reached the age of 30. Even then, he continued to take his main meals at the Krypteia with his comrades. Indulging in married life or showing affection publicly was seen as a form of weakness. A man who delayed marriage or refused it faced harsh social penalties, including public humiliation and denial of certain rights, because he failed in his primary duty to the state, producing more warriors. To understand all this harshness and iron discipline, we must look beneath the surface, to the deep-seated fear that governed Sparta. It wasn't a homogeneous society. The Spartan citizens, homoioi, the equals or peers, were just a small ruling minority, a class of warriors dedicated to governance and war. Below them were the perioikoi, inhabitants of the surrounding towns who were free, engaged in trade and crafts, paid taxes, and served as auxiliary troops, but lacked full political rights. And at the very bottom lay the vast, subjugated majority, the Helots. They weren't merely individual slaves, but an entire population, the original inhabitants of Messenia and Laconia, conquered by force, bound to work the land for their Spartan masters, cultivating it and handing over roughly half the produce. They lived in a state of perpetual resentment and simmering hatred, and they outnumbered the Spartans many times over, perhaps 10-1 or even more. This overwhelming number constituted a permanent existential nightmare for the Spartans. The fear of a massive Helot uprising was a constant obsession, shaping and driving the harshness of the entire system. The Agoge, the perpetual military life, the ban on luxury, all were designed not just to fend off external enemies, but primarily to ensure absolute military superiority over the enslaved majority within, and keep them firmly under control. This fear even spawned a terrifying practice known as the Krypteia. This was essentially a secret police or death squad composed of the most cunning and ruthless young men from the Agoge. Periodically, armed only with daggers, they were sent out to roam the Helot countryside at night. Their mission? To terrorize the Helots, spy on them, and assassinate any Helot who seemed suspiciously strong, intelligent, or showed potential signs of leadership or rebellion. It was a preemptive shadow war, designed to crush any potential resistance before it could start and keep the Helots in a perpetual state of fear. The Krypteia was the ugliest face of Spartan fear. And this complex system, this blend of discipline and fear, strength and brutality, is what produced Leonidas and the warriors who followed him. Men forged in the fires of the Agoge, imbued with absolute loyalty to Sparta to their very core, taught that death for their city was the highest form of glory. And now, we return to the narrow pass of Thermopylae, 480 BC. Leonidas, the king who survived the infant inspection and endured the Agoge, now faced the ultimate test. The hordes of the Persian Empire advanced to swallow Greece. Why did he choose to stay with just 300 of his own men, plus other allies, to face this overwhelming tide? Was it mere blind courage? Perhaps it was deeper. Did the oracle of Delphi's prophecy, said to have foretold that only the death of a Spartan king would save the city, echo in his ears? Did he intentionally go to fulfill his destiny? We can't know for sure. But what we do know is the mindset of the Spartan warrior. Death in battle, the kalos thanatos, wasn't failure. It was the culmination of a life dedicated to honor and duty. In those final moments, after the betrayal and the Persians' outflanking maneuver were discovered, despair likely wasn't the dominant feeling, but perhaps a sense of arrival. An opportunity to embody everything Sparta stood for before the eyes of the world. And let us not forget those who chose to die with them. The story isn't just about the 300 Spartans. Willingly remaining alongside them were about 700 warriors from the city of Thespiae, choosing to share the Spartans' certain fate in a stunning display of bravery and loyalty to Greece. They all fought side by side, Spartans and Thespians. until the end, not as automatons, but as men defending their freedom and choosing how they would meet their end. They were all killed in the end, as expected. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The precious days they bought with their blood slowed the Persian advance, giving crucial time for the rest of Greece to organize its naval and land defenses. More importantly, their heroic story inspired the Greeks, uniting them against the invaders, and sowing the seeds for the eventual defeat of the Persian Empire at the subsequent battles of Salamis and Plataea. Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, but an immortal moral and strategic victory. In Sparta itself, the news of the slaughter wasn't met with wailing but with stoic pride. The king and his men had fulfilled their ultimate duty. Their names were immortalized, becoming an example for future generations. The famous epitaph erected at the site proclaimed eloquently, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The loss didn't break the city's resolve. It likely reinforced its faith in the toughness of the system that produced such heroes. And their story didn't remain mere local history. The tale of Leonidas and the 300 transcended ancient Greece to become a universal human legacy, a symbol of desperate courage against overwhelming odds, of self-sacrifice for a greater cause, of holding the line until the very end. Through the ages, leaders, artists and writers have drawn inspiration from it as a powerful metaphor for the unconquerable human spirit. But this shining symbol, this immortal heroism, was born, as we've seen throughout our journey, from the womb of a system that was, by any measure, incredibly harsh and rigid. A system that began by killing infants, crushed individuality, employed terror, and programmed humans for violence and death. Herein lies the great paradox, the eternal dilemma of Sparta's legacy. Can we truly separate the dazzling heroism from its dark source? And can brutal means ever be justified to achieve ends that seem noble? The story of Sparta, from Mathios' tragedy at birth, to Alice's demanding upbringing, to Leonidas' life dedicated to war, culminating in his sacrifice at Thermopylae, isn't just a tale from the past. It's a mirror reflecting deep and unsettling questions about the nature of civilization, about the relationship between the individual and the state, and about the terrible price that is sometimes paid for strength, discipline, and glory. Questions that leave us thinking long after the sounds of battle have faded and only the echo of history remains.